Well, welcome to our first ever conference for the Arthur Perkins Study Center for Midwestern Presbyterianism. My name is Brian DeYoung, and I serve as the Executive Director. At the Perkins Study Center, we are convinced of two things at once. First, we are convinced of the truth that Midwestern Presbyterianism is wildly understudied. In fact, that is beyond dispute. Our second conviction is that Midwestern Presbyterianism is enormously interesting. Our purpose as a study center is to further the understanding and the appreciation of the rich history of Midwestern Presbyterianism through research, articles, books, podcasts, conferences, videos, and other methods of exploring and promoting our heritage. And tonight we take a significant step forward. The U.S. Census officially considers the Midwest region of the U.S. to consist of the following states: Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. Now, that is obviously a very large region, both geographically and culturally speaking. At the Perkins Study Center, we are interested in the story of Presbyterianism throughout the entire Midwest region. And we hope to collaborate with other interested folk who live in those many other states. But as for me, my focus is mainly and mostly on Wisconsin. And our lectures at this conference this weekend are going to stay within the borders of the state of Wisconsin. Tonight we will be looking at the Stockbridge Indians, then at the Reverend Jesse Minor. Tomorrow morning we will consider the Reverend Cutting Marsh, the Reverend Moses Ordway, and the Reverend Peter Zona. You may wonder why I chose to start with the Stockbridge Indians. And my answer is just this. The Stockbridge Indians were the first to conduct Protestant worship services in the territory that became the state of Wisconsin. I consider them to be Proto-Presbyterians, among the earliest Presbyterians in our state. They began the Presbyterian movement in Wisconsin. To put this same point in another way, I chose the Stockbridge Indians because God chose them to be at the head of this illustrious line. God placed them here in Wisconsin before he brought any of his other servants into this territory. So as we consider the history of this tribe, we always want to ask, what is God doing here? What are his purposes? And how does he glorify himself through these faithful believers? Let's look now at the roots of the Stockbridge tribe. The origins of the Stockbridge Indians go back to northeastern Asia. Now, that has been a somewhat controversial assertion, but there are two good reasons to believe that it is accurate. First, the tribe itself believed that this was true, as evidenced in their oral and written histories. They believed that they crossed the great water at the place where this and the other country are nearly connected. That is most likely the Bering Strait, where Russia and Alaska are a mere 51 miles apart. Although modern historians scoff at such claims, recent DNA studies in the genomes of Siberian people have shown a dual ancestry with Native American tribes. They share the same basic DNA because the Native Americans emigrated from Asia into America. One thing is far more certain. that the Native Americans were not descendants of Abraham and cannot be considered a lost tribe of Israel or the lost northern tribes of Israel. Though this theory was wildly popular with people in the 18th and 19th centuries, it is rightly viewed today as speculative and far-fetched. According to their own tribal history, once they arrived in North America, a famine compelled them to disperse themselves throughout the regions of the wilderness. They continued moving eastward until they eventually reached the Hudson River. And there they settled and carried on their traditional lifestyle of hunting, fishing, limited agricultural pursuits, and maple sugar making. Their tribal group was the Mohicans, of which the Stockbridge were one branch. When Europeans first arrived to explore this region, some Indians were kidnapped and either sold as slaves in the Caribbean or taken back to England to be trained and educated as guides for future expeditions. By so doing, the Europeans started their relationship with the Native American tribes, including the Mohicans, on a very bad footing. The Native Americans were understandably suspicious of the Europeans once these practices became known. As more Europeans came and began establishing settlements in America, the relationship with the native tribes developed. There was a strong interest among the European settlers to reach the Indians with the Christian gospel. Especially among the Mohicans, this evangelistic motive was clear and strong. For their part, the Mohicans were very interested in Christianity, and they welcomed the evangelistic efforts. But there were other interests as well. There were commercial interests, such as the purchase of tribal lands. The story of land acquisitions from natives to colonials is complicated, and it often caused friction between the two groups. This was further complicated when the U.S. government became involved and started proposing treaties. Well, sadly, the U.S. government's track record of making and breaking treaties often left the Indians impoverished. A yet more sinister development involved the sale of intoxicating spirits to the native tribes. Especially guilty in this regard were the Dutch traders, who frequently sold rum and other alcoholic beverages to the Indians. This led to devastating consequences for many of the tribes and would be a long-standing problem for Native Americans. Some of the colonial traders even discouraged the Indians from welcoming missionaries, since the Christian influence would discourage the purchase and the abuse of alcohol by the Indians. Our interest in this history is obviously focused on the Christian efforts to bring the gospel to these native tribes. Through the assistance and support of such groups as the Scottish Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge and the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, evangelistic ministries were initiated for the Indians of North America. The Mohicans received special attention due to their receptive attitudes toward Christianity. So now let's look at some of the missionaries to the Stockbridge tribe. The first person of importance in this ministry was John Sargent Sr. While a student at Yale University, Sargent became interested in the Indians of the Housatonic River area. This was where Stockbridge, Massachusetts would be located as a mission station for the Mohican tribe. Sargent visited the tribe and was deeply impressed with their spiritual need. The leaders of the tribe were open to Sargent as a missionary to live and to work among them, and they welcomed him as their pastor after he had finished his studies at Yale. John Sargent Sr. was a New England Puritan with a Calvinist outlook. He began his ministry among them in the fall of 1734. Even prior to taking up his work, Sargent studied the Mohican language so that he could communicate and preach in their own mother tongue. Sargent was committed to preaching and teaching, but also to providing education for the Mohican young people. He opened a school for them and began introducing them to the English language and the English way of doing things. It is true that he was a faithful and pious Christian missionary. It is also true that he and the mission sought to civilize the Indians by replacing their tribal customs and practices with a European approach to life. The accusation of cultural imperialism by the Europeans is not without some merit, though at the time, nobody on either side particularly seemed to mind. During his 15-year ministry, John Sargent Sr. was greatly loved. He successfully established a church among the Mohicans in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. His ministerial effectiveness declined somewhat after he married Abigail Williams. Abigail did not appreciate the Indians nearly as much as her husband did. Norman Rockwell's final painting is of John Sargent Sr. with Chief Conkapot, and Sargent's wife Abigail is seen hiding in the background, peeking around a corner suspiciously at the two men. John Sargent Sr. died in 1749 at the age of 39. He was replaced by one of the most famous theologians in American history, the Reverend Jonathan Edwards. Edwards served as a missionary in Stockbridge to the Mohicans for 7 years before leaving to become the third president of the College of New Jersey, which later became Princeton University. Jonathan Edwards never mastered the Mohican language as Sargent had done. He was much more academic, far less pastoral, and he spent much of his time writing theological treatises. A number of his very well-known books were written during his time in Stockbridge. After Edwards' departure, the tribe was served by the Reverend Stephen West for a brief time. West was also a Calvinist and held strong theological positions. The Stockbridge Mohicans also benefited from the ministry of the Reverend Sampson Occam, a Mohican Indian who became a Presbyterian minister. These men, in turn, gave way to the Reverend John Sargent Jr. Much like his father, John Sargent Jr. was well-beloved and warmly accepted by the congregation and the community. Having grown up among them, he understood their culture and he spoke their language fluently. In 1775, he took charge of the church and the school in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It was during his ministry in the 1780s that much of the tribe relocated to New York and established the town of New Stockbridge, New York. Sargent Jr. traveled with the Indians and continued his ministry among them in their new location. When they later made plans to relocate again to Indiana, he was prepared to go with them and to assist them. The Indiana plan ultimately failed, and Sargent continued his ministry in Stockbridge, New York, until his death in 1824. His 49-year ministry was profound and fruitful, and his death was a great blow to the Stockbridge tribe. After the death of John Sargent, Jr., the Scottish Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge appointed the Reverend Jesse Minor a Presbyterian minister. This was done in early 1825, and Minor began his ministry to the tribe in New Stockbridge, New York. I will have much more to say about Jesse Minor in my next lecture. His appointment was announced at the annual meeting of the United Domestic Missionary Society on May 13, 1825, and was then publicized in the third report of the United Domestic Missionary Society submitted by the Executive Committee at the annual meeting. In that report, it states, "Here are some interesting remains of a church of Christian Indians who have expressed their thanks to the society that since the death of their missionary, the Reverend John Sargent, we have sent one to preach to them the everlasting gospel. They have united with the other Christians in this town." And their new pastor was the Reverend Jesse Minor. Next, we turn to an indigenous spiritual leader. In 1770, John Metoxen was born to a Mohican family in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. One report relates that when young, Mr. Metoxen was a man of great bodily strength, and owing to many hard-fought personal conflicts in which he had been engaged, he was commonly styled the Stockbridge Bully. As a young man, he was educated at a Moravian school in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. John Metoxen was intellectually gifted, an effective speaker, a correct and fluent interpreter, and spiritually mature for his age. He possessed many valuable and necessary qualities for leadership, and he later served his tribe as their sachem, or head chief, for a number of years. In 1818, this Mohican man joined the church in New Stockbridge, of which he would become a deacon and a lay preacher. In 1822, Metoxen helped lead a portion of the tribe to the White River region of Indiana. Upon arrival, they learned that the land promised to them had been sold without their knowledge, and this necessitated a change in direction, which led them eventually to Green Bay in the Michigan Territory, which would later become the state of Wisconsin. They finally settled on the Fox River near Kaukauna. The town that they established was called Statesburg, and it was located to the northeast of modern-day Appleton. During those days, John Metoxen served as a spiritual leader for their tribe. Levi Conkapot Jr. reports that previous to the arrival of the Reverend Mr. Minor as missionary, Mr. Metoxen was in the habit, as his wife relates, of officiating as a religious teacher among the tribe. When they had good meetings and were much engaged in religion. After the arrival of Mr. Minor and during your own labors as missionary, and he means here cutting marsh, Mr. Metoxen was the only reliable man that could be resorted to as a correct and fluent interpreter. Conkapot also testified to Metoxen's eloquence, saying, "I have been frequently entertained in listening to the classic beauty and force as uttered by John Matuxin in the language of the Mahikaniok, whether delivered around the council fire of the nation or within the sacred walls of the sanctuary. Historian John Nelson Davidson describes John Matuxin as a true priest of a pure faith, a pilgrim surely in the earth, who led the little church of Indian Puritans as, according to the simple forms of our service, they worshiped God in the wilderness. Writing to his former pastor, the Reverend John Sargent, on December 2, 1823, John Matuxin reported on the condition of the souls under his care. And as I read this, think about what it communicates about John Matuxin, the author. He said, "I trust that some of them are choosing God for their portion, remembering that He is the only source of true happiness for the immortal soul, and grieving because they had forsaken the only King of the universe. It is true indeed that the soul was made for God. It came from God and can never be happy but in returning to Him. Thus we may have reason to believe that the Spirit of the Lord is moving upon them." That is theologically rich. Here is a man of spiritual maturity and wisdom assessing these people. And just the phrases and the ideas that he uses show much about Matuxin's spiritual eloquence and wisdom. Another significant leader during these times was John W. Quinney. He is perhaps the more famous of the leaders of that era. Quinney was really more of a political leader than a religious figure, but his influence complemented that of John Matuxin. Quinney was forward-thinking about the tribal government and how to interact with the American society that surrounded the Stockbridge Indians. Just as a side note, you can go to the old Indian cemetery in Stockbridge, Wisconsin, just to the east of Lake Winnebago, and within yards, you see the graves of John Matuxin and John Quinney and others of that tribe. It's really a fascinating little field trip if you're interested. Well, now I want to give you a first-hand view. An interesting description of the Stockbridge Christian community was supplied by the Reverend Calvin Colton, who visited the tribe in Statesburg prior to their relocation to the east side of Lake Winnebago. His report was published in 1833 under the title, "Tour of the American Lakes and Among the Indians of the Northwest Territory in 1830, disclosing the character and prospects of the Indian race." And in that report, Colton writes, "I am now writing from the mission house of the American Board on Fox River, 20 miles from its mouth, planted among the Stockbridge Indians, who have been encouraged to settle themselves here by the general government after having been disappointed of their claims on White River, Indiana. They number about 350 souls and have probably made greater attainments in the English language and manners and in the useful arts of civilized life and also in the Christian religion than any other tribe of the Aborigines on the continent. The Stockbridge Indians have heard the preaching of Brainerd and Edwards and have enjoyed Christian privileges and cultivations with little interruption for nearly 90 years. I saw a Bible yesterday, safely kept in a sort of ark at their place of worship, a remarkable relic of Hebrew custom, printed at Oxford, England in 1770, with the largest and finest type I have ever seen. He's speaking there about what's called the Stockbridge Bible, which was a gift from a nobleman in England to the tribe, and it was one of their great treasured possessions. Well, Colton then goes on to describe his experience on the Lord's Day among the Stockbridge in Statesburg. He writes, "Yesterday was the Sabbath, and a good day it was. I had never expected to come into this wilderness, so-called, and among these savages so esteemed, to enjoy a Christian Sabbath without witnessing a single impropriety among a whole people of this description. To see the congregation, the parents with their children, and the stranger within their gates, going up to the house of God in company, seating themselves with a reverence and decorum that might shame many communities calling themselves civilized and professing Christianity. Listening with fixed and unrelaxed attention to all the public services, many of them demonstrating a thorough religious abstraction and absorption. And when their hearts and conscience were appealed to in the application of the subject of the discourse, showing a depth and quickness of feeling which agitated their bosoms and forced a passage through the watery channels of the eye. And then to attend the Sabbath school, reduced to all the order and discipline which characterize the best schools of this sort in the white settlements, superintended indeed by the missionaries, but employing the adult natives as instructors who engage in their work with a ready aptitude and apparent satisfaction. This, too, was a scene unexpected and grateful beyond my power to express. And all was done in the English language, so pure that if my eyes had been shut and I could have forgotten where I was, my ears would have assured me that I was listening to the common exercises of a Sabbath school among the whites." What a beautiful scene of Sabbath worship and Sabbath rest. Well, let me now finish with some conclusions. Though there is much, much more to tell about the Lord's work among the Stockbridge Indians, let me conclude by returning to my opening remarks about the Stockbridge Indians as Proto-Presbyterians. Not only were the Stockbridge the first to conduct Protestant worship services in Wisconsin under the leadership of John Metoxen, but they were heavily influenced by New England Calvinism and Presbyterianism. In the good providence of God, the next two men who served this tribe, Jesse Minor and Cutting Marsh, were Presbyterians. The tribe continued to have connections with the Presbyterian Church in Wisconsin through the 19th and 20th centuries. During the period 1930 to 1970, the Presbyterian influences among the Stockbridge were both strong and distinct. Reverend Arthur Perkins and Reverend John Davies carried on significant ministry among the Stockbridge living near Gresham, Wisconsin. The old Stockbridge Orthodox Presbyterian Church formed in 1937 and continued its ministry for many years under such men as John Davies, Henry Phillips, Gordon Peterson, Mick Knierim, Josh Martin, Carl Thompson, and Micah Shin. The Menominee OPC in nearby Zoar was organized in 1981 to serve the Menominee Reservation, and more recently, Covenant Life OPC in Shawano has been serving under the ministry of the Reverend Gordon Oliver. There has been a Presbyterian presence among the Stockbridge for literally hundreds of years. While there have certainly been other Christian denominations connected with the Stockbridge people, Presbyterianism has been a constant for this tribe. Their continuing involvement, though waxing and waning at times, has remained significant. The Presbyterian movement in Wisconsin owes much to these brethren and to the ministers who have served them. As we today ponder our identity as Wisconsin Presbyterians, we cannot think solely in terms of European influences, though that is very tempting. We must factor in the Native American aspect of our ecclesiastical history and heritage as Presbyterians in this state if we are to properly understand and appreciate our true identity. This should not be an either-or consideration. Both of these people groups played an important role, the Stockbridge Indians and the Americans of European descent. Neither should we ignore the fact that the American and European influences were not always so righteous and respectable. As I've already mentioned, that sense of cultural superiority that is expressed by Americans of European descent tended to disdain Indian customs and practices. The American efforts to civilize the savage Indians sometimes merely exchanged one set of cultural patterns from Native American society with another set of cultural patterns from England. For example, record keeping for land sales and land purchases was handled far differently by Mohican culture than was done by the English. The English insisted on written records that were acknowledged by English courts. The Mohicans operated more on the basis of trust without demanding written deeds of sale. And how you handle the sale of land is certainly not the gospel of salvation. That's a cultural issue. There may be pluses or minuses, but we can't say this is a matter of righteousness, that this is a matter of orthodoxy. We must also face the reality that American traders, and yes, particularly those of Dutch ethnicity, aggressively introduced drunkenness and many attendant vices into Native American tribal culture. The devastation caused was enormous, and the decline of those tribes was stunning. That these American merchants would even discourage missionary activity in order to maintain their own profit margins is utterly inexcusable. We cannot baptize that. And this is not even to mention what the American government, both federal and state, frequently did by making promises and then breaking their legal treaties and binding obligations. The Stockbridge Nation repeatedly sent representatives to Washington, D.C. in order to address these wrongs. They were frequently disappointed by the responses that they received from government officials. And then they returned home to face yet another relocation to a new reservation on still more undesirable land. What the American government did often to the Native American tribes was downright shameful. Of this, we cannot boast. And yet, in the midst of this sometimes sad history, we see God's hand at work in planting and sustaining a humble community of believers who played a pivotal role in the development of Presbyterianism in Wisconsin. God willed that the Stockbridge tribe would lead the way, perhaps in order to humble American and European believers in the process. We owe a debt of gratitude to our Stockbridge brethren in the faith for their pioneering work so long ago. And if that stimulates us to rethink a few things about ourselves as Presbyterians, that is not altogether bad. It's good for us to look in the mirror and think about such things. Thank you.